introduction to Dan Gimmel. Firstly, I was born in a little town called Helvetia, West Virginia. Helvetia is an American name meaning New Switzerland, because all the founders of the town of Helvetia were from Switzerland. My grandfather, my father's father, was one of the original settlers of the town. Helvetia is situated 35 miles south and west of Elkins, West Virginia. My parents came down here to Pennsylvania from Helvetia in the early 20s in the Connellsville area, and they lived here until both of them passed away. They had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. I was the oldest son, the second child. Members of the Rotary Club might remember my brother Kermit. He came and spoke to the Rotary Club on 2 or 3 occasions. He was a rather high official in the CIA for 30 years. In fact, he wrote the legislation that formed the CIA. I went to school in the Connellsville area, attended Dunbar Township Elementary Schools, attended Dunbar Township High School through my sophomore year, at which time my parents moved down to the Periopus area. I attended Periopus High and graduated there in 1937. Shortly after my graduation, my father sustained an injury in the mines, and that's where I had to go. See, I worked in there for about 4 years, 3 years or so. 3 years, I guess. And I decided, along with my mother, that the mines wasn't any place for me. My father, in the meantime, had recovered and went back to work. So I went down to Washington, D.C., and I worked in the War Department, which was under the direction of General George Marshall at the time. I worked there for a year or so, and one afternoon I went to lunch, and when I came back I joined the Navy. I went down in the basement, and in about 35 minutes I was in the Navy. And I went back to the job and told them what I'd done, and I got my first military chewing out by General Marshall. I can still hear him. He says, "God damn it, Gimmel, if you wanted to join something, you could have joined the Army. I could have got you in the Army. You didn't have to go to the Navy." But there I was. I was in the Navy. So I quit my job. Didn't really quit, I resigned. And I came back home, and I think it was about a week later, I went back down and reported to the Norfolk Naval Air Station, training station there in Norfolk, and did 3 months in boot camp. And I recall that day when I walked in the gate at Norfolk. I was a pretty sharp dresser back in those days, and we stepped through up to the gate. There was about 4 or 5 of us aboard the boat that went down to Norfolk. And we reported to the guard at the gate and told him who we were. He says, "Okay, just line up over there on the sidewalk." And about that time, some apprentice seaman who was from the boot camp area, had been there maybe a week or 10 days, he came and took charge of us. And he was anything but pleasant. I said, "Holy mackerel, Daniel, what have you done to yourself?" But I went in, and I soon learned to love the Navy. I really did. I wouldn't give up one day of it, even with all the bad times. I made a lot of good friends. I have friends all over the world. I've traveled all over the world. I sat down once. I think that I computed and counted up, I was in 85% of all the free nations of the world by the time I retired. I had been on all 5 continents. I was on 7 continents, excuse me. the 5 we all know, and I was in Antarctica and Arctic. So I've had a few travels in all 50 states of the United States. An education I could never buy. Well, I joined the Navy while I was working in the War Department, and my first voyage aboard a ship was from Washington, D.C. down to Norfolk, Virginia. So I started out as a true sailor. My first trip in the Navy was aboard the ship, the boat rather, going down the Potomac River to Norfolk. I spent 31 years approximately in the Navy. I retired as a Navy commander. I started out as an apprentice seaman. And during the course of my 30 years, I transitioned from that lowly position of apprentice seaman through all of the enlisted brackets. I held all of the warrant officer commissions and retired as a commander. Let's see, I retired in 1972. After I retired out of the Navy, I was living on the West Coast, and I went into the consumer finance business. Unfortunately, 2 months after I retired, my first wife passed away. And after about 6 or 8 months in the consumer finance business, I decided to come back home. I had an elderly mother here, and I came back to work to take care of her. I got myself involved in real estate and insurance, and I was working out of Washington, PA. Oh, I don't know how long it was after I was back. I went to church one Sunday, and I had gone to the Presbyterian church, and I met the minister of the church, Shelley Blair, old member of our Rotary Club, since passed away. And Shelley asked me if I would be interested in being a Rotarian. I said I would. So I've been a Rotarian for about 20 years. I held most of the jobs in our Rotary Club, and I'm past president of the Rotary Club. In 1981-82, I was the president. I'm a firm believer in the concept of Rotary. I firmly believe that the cost of our passage through this life is service. Service above self. And I strive to do that. Oh, I was born back in October the 2nd, 1919, back in Helvetia, West Virginia. Mm-hmm. Well, I think during my school tenure, I was involved in everything that one could be involved in. In the elementary schools, I sang in the chorus. We didn't have a lot of athletics in the elementary schools in those days. We played little basketball, except played little football out in the play yard more than anything else. We didn't have the activities in school back then that we have now. In high school, at Dunbar, I went out for football. Believe it or not, I wasn't as heavy as I am now. I was a rather tall, thin young fellow, and I wasn't really heavy enough to make the team. But when we moved to Perryopolis, I played on the basketball team down there. And Perryopolis didn't have a football team. Maybe I was lucky they didn't. I might not have made it, really, because I still wasn't very heavy. Down there, under the tutelage of the principal, Earl E. Curtis, well-known name around Fayette County. I was the extemporaneous speaker for the high school. I was on the debating team, sang in their quartet, about everything they had. Starred in several of their plays. My employment in the War Department, I worked in the personnel administrative department of the War Department. And when I first started out, I had a low job, and in the short time I was there, I worked up, and I was working in the outer administrative office for General Marshall, who we all know who General Marshall was, our local Uniontown general. And how did I get in the Navy? I think one day I was kind of disgruntled. I had always wanted to be in the Navy. When I graduated from high school, there was no employment, and I attempted to enlist in the Navy. And back then you had a long waiting list. And when it came time for me to be called, that was the time my father sustained his injury, and I had to decline going in. So that was back in the 37. And this is in the 1940s. I went to lunch one day. I suppose I was a little disenchanted about something, and I walked by a post office, and there was that finger pointing at me, and he says, "We want you." And I went down in the basement, and in about 35 minutes I was in the Navy. And I went back to the job and told him what I'd done, and I got my first military chewing out by General Marshall. I can still hear him. He says, "God damn it, Gimmel, if you wanted to join something, you could have joined the Army. I could have got you in the Army. You didn't have to go to the Navy." But there I was. I was in the Navy. So I quit my job. Didn't really quit, I resigned. And I came back home, and I think it was about a week later, I went back down and reported to the Norfolk Naval Air Station, training station there in Norfolk, and did 3 months in boot camp. And I recall that day when I walked in the gate at Norfolk. I was a pretty sharp dresser back in those days, and we stepped through up to the gate. There was about 4 or 5 of us aboard the boat that went down to Norfolk. And we reported to the guard at the gate and told him who we were. He says, "Okay, just line up over there on the sidewalk." And about that time, some apprentice seaman who was from the boot camp area, had been there maybe a week or 10 days, he came and took charge of us. And he was anything but pleasant. I said, "Holy mackerel, Daniel, what have you done to yourself?" But I went in, and I soon learned to love the Navy. I really did. I wouldn't give up one day of it, even with all the bad times. I made a lot of good friends. I have friends all over the world. I've traveled all over the world. I sat down once. I think that I computed and counted up, I was in 85% of all the free nations of the world by the time I retired. I had been on all 5 continents. I was on 7 continents, excuse me. The 5 we all know, and I was in Antarctica and Arctic. So I've had a few travels in all 50 states of the United States. An education I could never buy. A little bit about my Navy. I wasn't always a naval officer. You recall,
right.
I started out as an apprentice seaman in Norfolk. And when we got our first assignment, I was assigned to a battleship. And I went and reported to the battleship, and all of us really wanted to get into aviation. Aviation was starting to grow, and I had, back in the early 30s, had learned to fly here in Connellsville area. I had gone to Penn State University and took an examination, won a scholarship to learn to fly. And I learned to fly right out of Connellsville Airport. So I really wanted to get into aviation. I didn't want much to do with that battleship Navy. So I asked for a request for a transfer into aviation. And aviation was really growing at the time. And by golly, I got the transfer. And I went into aviation. And I got assigned to a couple of technical schools and came out as a petty officer and leader of my class. I just continued to work in aviation and received promotions and all the way up to Chief Petty Officer, which was the highest rate at the time in the enlisted bracket. And my monthly salary as a Chief Petty Officer was $92 a month. And as a Chief Petty Officer, I had as high as 150 to 200 men under my command, and I directed their efforts. As an apprentice, I made, I started out, I think it was $16 a month. And I was in about a month, and it raised to $21 a month. But by the time back then you had to pay for your medical attention, and you had to buy insurance, and when you got a few things out of the PX to take care of your personal needs, you didn't have much money left out of $21. After I got out of the technical schools, I was assigned to an outfit where we went through commando training. And we were a commando outfit in the Navy commandos. And we knew where we were headed. We were headed for the Pacific, and fight out in the Pacific. So we were moved from the East Coast over to the West Coast, where we went through very rigid training. I met my first wife there. I didn't marry her then, but I met her then. And we went off, and my first encounters with combat was on Guadalcanal. I was with the Marine outfit. After my tour with the Marines, we were fighting there on Guadalcanal. We were on one side of Henderson Field, and the Japs were on the other side. And we were trying to operate airplanes at the same time. One little incident that happened I recall many times. Had one of my fighter aircraft come back, and he had taken a bullet through one of the blades of the propeller, which threw the propeller clear out of balance. We didn't know how we were going to fly that airplane. So we didn't have any spare propellers, and I decided, I was head of the maintenance crews, I said, well, let's just bring the blades up and we'll put a hole through the other two cross blades, which we did. And it fairly well balanced out the prop on the airplane, and we just put the damn thing up in the air and let her go, you know. Made a hell of a lot of noise, but still the airplane was flying. Those were some rough times there on Guadalcanal. And I worked myself through assignments up through the chain of the islands of the Pacific, clear up to Hollandia in New Guinea. I had to go into New Guinea. The Navy had an airplane that went down in the jungle, and I had to take a crew. I had a crew of 5 men. And we went to Hollandia, which was basically in the hands of the Japanese at the time. We had some Army contingents, but not where our airplane was down. So we had to go in there and find that airplane, and we fixed that airplane. We'd taken the parts that we thought it needed, and then we turned it over to the Army, and they had a pilot fly the thing back to the ship. And I'd been over there and then about 2.5 years. And when I came back from that job, I got my orders back to the States. Came back and got married, first class petty officer. I think I was making about $72 a month then as a first class petty officer. Was assigned to Jacksonville area, which is now the Municipal International Airplane Port down at Jacksonville. And what we had down there, we had a fighter contingent which was manned by Marines, and we had the old Liberator bombers that were flying, and I was the petty officer in charge of the fighter detachment of the enlisted people, and we provided fighter training for the Liberator bombers as they went out. We flew fighter attacks on the Liberator bombers in the Jacksonville area to send the new pilots out to the war zone. After that, I went down to Mayport to the station, air station down there, which was a very small station, but something very interesting happened down there while I was there. The Navy got the idea that they wanted to dredge out the harbor down at Mayport, and I became involved in that task, and it's been all dredged down, and it's now the home of some of the largest carriers that we have. So I thought that was rather interesting, being in on the groundwork of developing the harbor for Mayport. I was still a chief petty officer down there, and after I left Mayport, I was assigned to a dive bombing squadron. We were flying SBDs, then we went into SBCs, and there I really ruined my head and I couldn't fly much after that as an air crewman. I burst both the drums in my ear. We'd go up, process of dive bombing, you go up about 13, 14,000 feet, nose that airplane over, and pull out about 2,000 or 3,000 feet when you're dropping your bombs. And I'd always had problems with my ears, and that was really the finishing touches for that type of flying.
What's the purpose of going straight down, though?
Well, you're coming right in on your target just like that, and it's kind of not what they call skip bombing now, but it's just a procedure for dropping the bombs where you're going to be coming in more directly on your target, having less chance of missing your target. You come down as close as you can get to it and flare your airplane out, and when just before you come out, you've dropped your bombs, and then you're out of the way.
Those laser-guided missiles, huh?
Those aren't guided missiles. You were guiding the missiles is what you were doing.
They were Gimmel guided missiles.
In essence, they were. And after I left the dive bombing squadron, I was assigned to an outfit that probably most of you know. I was assigned to the Blue Angels, the very first unit of the Blue Angels, which is the acrobatic flying team of the Navy now. They fly jets now, of course, but we had propeller aircraft then. And that was back in 1946, I believe it was. 45 or 46. When I left the Blue Angels, I went back out into the Pacific, and I decided I'd been a chief petty officer long enough, I'd better work a little bit and try to transition into the officer status. Fortunately, took all the exams and passed and was selected to be a warrant officer. I started out as a W1, which is the lowest rank of the warrant officer, and I transitioned through grade 4, W4, which is the highest rank of the warrant officer, which is about equivalent to a lieutenant or lieutenant commander. I was then, back in the early 60s, I guess it was, I was moved over and was selected to be a line officer, a limited duty line officer in the aviation technical services area. And I started out as a junior grade lieutenant, and I worked at it and continued to go to school all the time, and eventually was promoted to rank of commander before I retired in 1972. I've had varied degrees of assignments and responsibilities. I was, for 5 years, I was in the business of working with the naval attaché offices in the embassies. I was assigned to several embassies and worked for the naval attaché officers in these offices.
Is that a division of the Naval Intelligence?
Yes, yes and no. Actually, they come under the State Department. They work for the ambassador. We're directly assigned to his staff. And we really were in the intelligence business is what we were. Didn't make any difference where we were. and work we were doing, we were out to gather data of an intelligence nature that would have given assistance to our country in pursuit of our objectives. And you did strange little things, like if you went to a beach and you had to travel and visit a lot of countries, you would drop a cigarette on the beach where there was stones and sand, etc., and take a shot, a picture of that cigarette. And from that cigarette, and comparing it to the sand and the consistency of the sand and the stones that happened to be on the beach, they were able to discern the consistency of the beach if they ever had to make a landing and go in there. You know, a lot of little tricks to the business of gathering intelligence. I remember one time we were visiting an automobile factory in one of the countries in Europe. The ambassador had to go there. So the naval attaché and myself, we flew them. We were flying the ambassador. And we were visiting this automobile factory, and we had good inclinations that there was something being built other than automobiles in the factory. So we were all in this party, and they were escorting us around. And I had been told that I was going to get lost from the main party and see if I could get back in the area and find out what was going on back there in the factory, which I did. But I was encountered back where I had no business being, and the first thing I knew, I had guns all pointing at me from everywhere, you know. And they took me forward, and they were going to lock me up. But fortunately, I belonged to the ambassador's party, diplomatic immunity, so they didn't do anything to me. They determined I hadn't really seen anything, but they weren't quite as sure as I was. I knew what I had seen back in there, and we reported what we saw, and it was a good piece of intelligence and information for the intelligence community.
Nothing is classified that we're talking about, right?
No, nothing is classified. What I've said is okay. You know, nobody knows where this was.
They could care less now.
No, could care less now. But it was quite an experience. It was after the war, the World War II actually, but have those guns pointed at you from all directions was rather frightening, really.
What country was that in?
No, I'm not going to tell you what country this was in, because then it could be tracked down. And that's about it for the military career. You know, I've worked on all kinds of aircraft. Another interesting program that I was in, though, that might be of interest to the members of the club, if you recall, after World War II, and the Cold War really got started, Uncle Sam determined that he had to put a blanket around the United States, and he had to put a barrier up of some kind. And so what they did, they built, if you recall, what they called the dew line going across northern Canada and up in the Arctic Circle area. They put a lot of radar stations up there. And they also established a flight line on the down coming from the north up in the Arctic Circle area down through the Pacific all the way down to Midway Island. And they did the same thing over on the East Coast from the Icelandic area down across to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So what we really had was a surveillance barrier that made kind of a horseshoe around the United States. And that was the I was involved in the airborne barrier work. We flew, if you recall, the old Constellation aircraft, which was a super airline aircraft at the time. The military took that aircraft and they modified it. And they put radar domes on the top and radar domes under the belly of that aircraft, and we had the most sophisticated electronics equipment that there was at the time. And we were flying airborne barrier from Midway Island all the way up to the Arctic Circle and back. took 17 hours for that flight. And when it was time for you to fly, that 17 hours encompassed about 24 hours because you had to be briefed before you went on the flight. Your flight was 17 hours long, and you came back and was debriefed. So before you got finished, you had put in 24 hours. And what we did while we were out there, we had these Constellation-type aircraft with the radar equipment on it, and we had a crew of men, and we were maintaining them. And we had a constant flow of aircraft. The radar had a given reach, and so we had an overlap, and there was never a break in the surveillance of the air in all the time that we started that barrier that I was there. That record was never broken after I left that organization. At the same time, they had submarines that were patrolling the Pacific in the water. So we had a double barrier, one in the air and one down in the water, monitoring what was going on and keeping track of where all the Russians were and the possible incoming of their equipment into our country, so that we could be notified and given an alert. So that was a very interesting job. I was there in that job nearly 2 years. And after the barrier job, I came back and I went down in the Memphis area, and I became a teacher. And I taught the business of management of aviation and maintenance and upkeep of aircraft to the officer corps of the Navy, from Navy captains down. And during that period, I was honored as being the best instructor in the school system down there. I was very proud of that. I also, at that time and afterwards, was in a very elite inspection team which went around through the various commands and was the inspecting group, like the inspector generals in the Army, I guess, and we checked the organizations for their material readiness and operational readiness. And I did a lot of traveling in that job, which was most interesting. Being shot at in Guadalcanal, I think, in the jungle, you never knew where your enemy was. The flying was dangerous when you were being shot at while you were flying. I think the ground war when I was on Guadalcanal was really the most dangerous part. Even though I did service during the Korean War and during the Vietnam War, I was at both places. I went over in the Korea on the ships, but I was never really directly involved in the ground fighting anywhere, as I was during World War II in Guadalcanal, which is the same in Vietnam. I had, at the time when the Vietnam War was going on, I had a command, and I was located in the San Francisco area, and I had approximately 250 highly qualified technical engineers that were in my command. And what we did was provide technical services to all of the operating units, particularly in the Pacific. When they ran into technical problems with their sophisticated equipment, they would call on our engineers, and I had to get them out there and get the problems fixed and get them out of trouble and let them go on about their business. And in fact, I was in that job when I retired out of the Navy. That was the most rewarding job, really, it was. Because those people, we had all of this sophisticated equipment that was coming into the inventory at the time, and I had this cadre of highly, highly skilled, qualified men, both military and civilian men. And wherever they were needed in the Navy throughout the world, we had to dispatch them. And that required a lot of traveling on my part to go and visit these outfits. And I'd send some of the men, and some of the men would go and be assigned for quite some time because the equipment was so new that they were there to teach the people who were required to operate that equipment. So I really enjoyed that job. And from that, I came out and became a civilian. I went on the retainer list of the Navy in 1972. Retainer list, I say, not retired list, because I was a USN officer. I wasn't a reserve officer, so I really never was retired. In fact, today I'm still on the retainer list, meaning that anytime they need me, they can call me back. After I retired, I went into the consumer finance business on the West Coast because that's where I retired. And I had, after I worked for an outfit called CIT. And I worked with them about 6 months, and I was about ready. I was going to be assigned my own office. In the interim, while I was working for them, my first wife passed away. She became ill on a Sunday, and the following Friday she was gone. Then I was alone. Stop it. Hadn't thought of that in a long time.
Hits you hard, huh, Dan?
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Rotary, all right? Let's go into how you got started into it, why you like Rotary.
Oh, okay. That's good. Enough for the military and what I did as a civilian. As I said, shortly after I came back to the Connellsville area, Shelley Blair asked me to join the Rotary, and I did. He submitted my name for approval, and I was accepted. And this was way back when Rotary was meeting down in the old YMCA, up on the 3rd floor of the YMCA. I knew that it was a service organization, and there's one thing about being in the military, you move around so much that you never really have the advantage of becoming a part of any given community for any length of time. So you aren't able to become involved in the workings of the community in which you live, really. So when I came back to Connellsville, and Shelley asked me if I'd like to be a Rotarian, and I became a member, and I recall the fellows that really were good to me when I first came in. It was Paul Sandusky, George Onasek, and a few of the members that are no longer with us. They're gone, that the current members probably wouldn't know them anyway. But they kind of took me in tow and taught me what Rotary was about, and I believed in it. I believe in what it stands for. And I became involved and tried to work anywhere that they assigned me in Rotary. And in so doing, I worked on almost all the committees that there were assigned. And I worked as the secretary for a while, and I was the treasurer for a while, and then I became the president of the club. And I felt that when I was president, we had a very successful year. We had a good growth in membership. We had numerous community projects that we were working on and provided assistance to, and some of those programs are still being supported by the Rotary, and I'm most proud that they are. And I firmly believe in the Rotary Foundation. I think each of our members should really take a real good look at what the Rotary Foundation stands for. And I think if they would do this, they would come to the conclusion that they should really support it more strongly than they do. Presently in our club we have 22 Polhar's Fellows. Our first Polhar's Fellow was Gene Ghost, as I recall, then Tom Scott. And then about that time, after Tom became a Polhar's Fellow, I've been on the Rotary Foundation committee since that time. And I worked and promoted the foundation, and gradually over those years, we have increased our membership as Polhar's Fellows to the number of 22. I'm still, I believe, assigned to the, well, I know that I am assigned to the Rotary Foundation Committee. And the benefits that are derived from the monies that are contributed to the foundation are returned to the United States and to Rotary many folds. You couldn't buy the returns that those young ambassadors, particularly the students that go abroad and represent Rotary in the United States in any other manner. And I would strongly urge all of our members to look at that foundation, know what it's about, and become involved in it. There's not only the educational program portion of the foundation, there are several strong programs. The exchange program, where the foundation sends a team of 5 businessmen from the community, and they're led by a Rotarian as their team member, and they go abroad to a foreign country to study their business and professional procedures, to learn how they do it and come back, and if that which is good, try to get it incorporated at home. And the same thing happens from the other countries where we have Rotary. They send teams to the United States for the same purpose. And every dollar that goes into the foundation is used for that purpose. Like instead of like the other charities that most of us give to, where 50, 60, or 70% of the contributed dollars go to administrative costs, your dollar that is given to the Rotary Foundation, 100% of that dollar goes to the fulfillment of those various programs. The value of my service to the United States while I was in the military, and here again, you hear the word service, because he who spends a lifetime in the military loves his country and has a strong desire to serve it. And that is true of all career military people. And that is not to downgrade the approach that the non-career man takes towards his service in the military while he is there, or any other individual. The civilian loves his country as much as the military man does. But the military man is directly involved in providing a service not only to his country, but that service is broken down and is provided to his state and to his community and to all of the citizens of the United States. And after a career of 31 years and looking back over it, that service is the most rewarding part of having served the United States of America. Thinking about the Rotarians in the club, I suppose I've had a closer relationship with Gene Ghost than any of the other Rotarians. I find Gene Ghost to be, of all the Rotarians that I know, and I know many Rotarians throughout the district of 73330, Gene is probably as dedicated or more dedicated to Rotary and has been for, I've been a Rotarian for 20 years, and Gene, I'm sure, was a Rotarian at least 10 or 12 years prior to that. All of those years. It didn't make any difference what Gene has been asked to do, he has done it. Even though I have, since my relationship with him, I've volunteered him for an awful lot of chores. And we've had a little bantering going back and forth regarding my volunteering Gene and myself for doing a lot of these things. Nevertheless, he did it willingly. And I think Gene provides a prime example of a Mr. Rotarian. George Honasek. I've known George Honasek since I was a little boy. George and I lived on the same street out in Trotter back in the way back in the 20s. And then his family moved into Connellsville. And I knew nothing of George until I came back to Connellsville and joined the Connellsville Rotary, and there he was. And George has been my friend. He believes in Rotary. He not only gives of himself, but he gives of his pocketbook to Rotary. An interesting item about George. When he was a young man, George was quite a dancer. In fact, his dancing partner was my first cousin. And they were about as good a dancing team that I have seen in my travels. And George and my cousin's name was Brennis Slaughter. And they did an adagio dance that, as a Rotarian and seeing George now, and you who know George, could never visualize George being a dancer and in that costume and taking this young girl, throwing her across the dance floor, dragging her by the hair, if you know anything about the old adagio dance. But that was George. I won't ever forget when we first got into the business of having a pancake dinner. The first one we had, in fact. Furnace was the chairman of the committee. And we had it out in the, the Armory out in South Pittsburgh. And we had the dinner that day, end of January. And I think it was one of the coldest days we've had in Connellsville in 50 years. And a water pipe burst out there by the Armory building. And the ice had built up around the entrance to the building. The ice must have been 3-4 feet high around the entrance. And the building, we did the cooking down in the basement, and we had to carry the food up 2 flights of stairs to get the food to the people. But it was the beginning of one of the projects under Furness's tutelage that still is going on to this day. We've never really gotten a report from Furness on how much money we really made that day, but we made some money. Maybe one day when he isn't too busy, he'll sit down and work out that report and give it to the club officially. Yes, I served as president of the Pleasant Valley Country Club. I believe I was president 2 or 3 years. I was on the board for about 7 or 8. I was president at the time when the old country club burned down. And as such, I had the responsibility of trying to bring together those members that were left after the club burned down. And we came together and we built the new clubhouse that is out there. That was a real task. I'm very proud of that building out there. It was a very small nucleus of members of that club, some of whom are members of our Rotary Club. That because of their efforts and their energies, Connellsville, the community of Connellsville, has that country club building out there, which is used extensively by all of Connellsville. It isn't used primarily by the members of the Pleasant Valley Country Club. We as a Rotary Club use it. Kiwanis uses it. All of the social and service clubs and organizations around Connellsville use that club out there. And I'm very proud that I was able to be associated with and contributed to the construction of that building out there at the Pleasant Valley Country. Another area of service above self. I worked day in and day out, 7 days a week on that project out there. At the same time, I was president of the Rotary Club, believe it or not. And Clara, my wife, became my secretary, and she started a log of all the communications that came into me. It's unbelievable, the hundreds and hundreds of telephone calls that were received here that I had to attend to during the period of constructing that building out there. Plus all my Rotary work at the same time. Yes, I was on the Chamber of Commerce. I was chairman of a membership drive for them. Dick Franks was president of the Chamber at the time, and Dick asked me if I would head the membership drive committee, which I did, and I spent many, many hours on the phones in contacting business and professional people in the Connellsville area, striving to increase the membership of the Chamber of Commerce. Here's another area that I strongly feel that any business or professional man cannot afford not to belong to the Chamber of Commerce of Connellsville. Here is an agency whose prime objective is to enhance and improve the area of Connellsville. Well, I belong to a lot of clubs, a lot of service clubs. I'm a member of the Elks. I've been a Masonic man for nearly 45 years. I've been a member of the Elks Club 20-some years or so. I belong to the Episcopal Church in Connellsville. I was a senior warden of the church for about 6 or 7 years, and then I decided it was time to let somebody else do the job.
Senior warden?
The senior warden being the senior lay individual that manages and conducts the energies and efforts of the church. Clara? I met Clara after I came back to Connellsville and having lost my first wife on a blind date. I met Clara in Washington, D.C. area. I was down visiting my brother, and he says, would you like to go out on a date with this young lady? I says, why not? And so we went to the races that day. Kermit's wife, my brother Kermit and his wife, Catherine, and Clara. Clara met Kermit's wife, Catherine, through a bridge club. And I was down visiting him, and Catherine said, you have to meet Clara. You want to go on this date? And I said, sure. So we went to the horse races that day, and I haven't been away from her since. It took 3 years before we got married, but we maintained a very close contact and relationship for those 3 years, and then we got married in 1977. Best thing that I ever did.
How does she?
She's a real princess.
Okay.
Clara to me is a real princess. She's my love. And whatever regardless of what I become involved with, Clara becomes a part of that. Those of you who are members of the Rotary Club know that Clara is involved in Rotary. When they have a blood program, Clara is a part of that blood program. She's up there serving the refreshments that is provided, and has done this for ever since the blood program started. We have a rose sale that we do annually. Clara is involved in the rose sale. In fact, last year, Clara and Johnny Fiesta's wife sold more roses than any Rotarian. Just this past, what is today, Wednesday? Monday, this past Monday, they had a rose sale down at the bank. Who were the sellers? Clara and Johnny Fiesta's wife. Those two girls were down there from 9 o'clock in the morning to noon time, selling roses. Wasn't a Rotarian in sight. She's a real believer in Rotary, Clara is. She believes as firmly in the Rotary Foundation as I. And she is a Paul Harris Fellow. Clara is a Paul Harris Fellow, and it was my esteemed pleasure to see that she was. Knowing her beliefs in the Rotary Foundation, the educational programs, and the benefits derived from it. Well, I think that might be a good analysis. Claire many times tolerates me. I can be hard to live with, I'm sure. But she's a loving woman. She cares for me as I care for her. We have fun together. We're friends. We do everything and anything together. We might be here today and in Florida 2 days from now. We just say, let's go, we pick up and we go. We have a fine family. I had the one daughter, and Claire had a daughter and 2 sons. So we have 2 daughters and 2 sons. We have 1, 2, 3 grandchildren and one great grandchild.
One great grandchild.
One great grandchild. My granddaughter has a little daughter who is about 2 years old. Well, let's see, the 4 children, one is crowding 50, one is in the mid-40s, 2 is in the mid-40s.
What's their names? The 50-year-old.
Abby is crowding 50. I'm not going to tell you how much she's
What's her
crowding.
last name?
Abigail, she has an initial. She's a dear girl. I love her dearly. She enlightens my life. She lives down in the Washington, D.C. area, and she's been married a couple of times, and she isn't now. And so she says, I'm going to choose a name, and I'm never ever going to change it again if I get married 20 times. So she changed her name to where she has the initials AKA. So her name is Abby Alcott. And she's a head writer for the ABC News in Washington, D.C. station and the Good Morning America program that you see on TV every morning. She is the news writer. She writes what they say the news readers say she writes. She's a very talented girl. The next in age is Tom. Tom is a computer whiz, and he lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. Tom is 45. In fact, he just got married again. Claire and I were up to see him get married here this past week when you wanted to come and have the interview, and I wasn't feeling well, and I said I had to go away. That's where we were. We had to go to Tom's, or to Dan's wedding. His name is Dan Kleiner. That was Clara's former married name, Kleiner. And she had another.
Dan or Tom?
Did I say his name is Dan?
Okay,
He has
you
the
mentioned
same.
Tom.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
The oldest son's name is Dan, same as mine.
Mm-hmm.
And her second son is named Tom, and he's a certified public accountant. And he lives in New Jersey, is married, and has a daughter who is about 10. And she's the joy of my life. I have a lot of fun with that little girl. And he has a very talented wife. She was a librarian of a county in New Jersey and decided she wanted to be a lawyer. So she went to school and recently graduated from law school, has taken her exams, hasn't got the results of the exams as yet, but she's going to pass the first time. I know she's going to pass the first time. Her name is Helen. Lovely girl and a very intelligent lady, and she's going to make one hell of a good lawyer for the family. And my own daughter's name is Danelle, so we have a Dan son, and a daughter, Danelle. And Danelle is in her 40s, and she lives north of Boston. She lives in a little town called Methuen, just this side of the New Hampshire border. And she is in the business of providing service. She's in the service industry, in the medical services industry. Abigail has 2 sons. One is a lawyer, a graduate of Harvard. The other boy is presently in Japan. He works for a Japanese company, is married to a Japanese girl. And he works on the business statements for a lot of different corporations. I think what he basically does, he changed jobs recently, and what he does in these Japanese corporations, he puts their statements into English. For a long time he was teaching Japanese English. Tom and Helen have this little girl, Jill, who is 9. And Danelle has the daughter, Britt Michelle, who is my granddaughter, and she is 24. And she has my great-grandchild, Samantha, who is 2. What advice would I give to up-and-coming Rotarians? I would recommend to any individual becoming a Rotarian that you find out what Rotary is all about. Learn what the 4 avenues of service are, what the objectives of each of these avenues are, and contribute to attaining those objectives to the degree that you are able. You're not going to learn what Rotary is about by osmosis. You have to study what Rotary is about. There are many books that are written about Rotary. There is a catalog of library books that addresses each of the areas of service. What it has done from the beginning up to the current, the accomplishments of these areas of service. Now, these accomplishments didn't take place on their own. It took the efforts of all of the Rotarians, each and every one, to make Rotary the international organization that it is, that is dedicated to better understanding and peace. And an interesting item about the house that I was born in Helvetia, was the home of the cousin of the man that wrote the song Silent Night. It's a very interesting little town. It's still there. It resembles Switzerland very much, if you have ever been to Switzerland, as the valleys and the very steep mountains that rise from the valley. And my grandfather on my paternal side, had a farm that's set up on the hill. He had a couple of 100 acres up there. And really, I'm just a second generation American on my father's side. And he was quite a man, my father. As a young man, up on the farm, when he's out bringing the cows in and working, he was a real yodeler. And even today, when I go down to Helvetia and visit with some of the old timers down there, they speak of hearing my father yodeling up on the side of the mountain, and everybody would stop and listen to him yodel while he was bringing the cows and etc. in up there on the mountain. They came from Bern, Switzerland. My grandmother and my grandfather came from Bern, Switzerland. And he was the last child of, I think they had 12 children. Had to have a lot of children back then. And they still have festivals there in Helvetia, and they don the Swiss dress and do the Swiss dances. And they used to be famous for their Swiss cheese, but the old people are about all gone. The Swiss makers and the young people have gone off and found better things to do than milk the cows and bring in the milk and make the Swiss cheese the way it has to be made. But they do have an interesting festival up there each year. I don't know how many of you are acquainted with or know what a ramp is. A ramp is a form of wild onion. It's about 3 times stronger than any garlic bud that you have ever eaten. Looks just like an onion. And each year they go out into the woods and they gather the ramps and they cook them. You can cook them many ways. You boil them, and after you boil them, you can scramble them with eggs. If you've ever taken spinach and scrambled eggs with your spinach and a little bit of chopped up bacon, they cook them that way. Or you just eat them raw. And when you eat them raw, nobody will be within 6 miles of you. I mean, your breath is bad bad. But believe it or not, 3 or 4 years ago I went down. Claire and I go down most every year. And this one year, there were people there from as far away as Chicago. and New York City. And there was people from Richmond, Virginia standing in line with me to get in that hall to eat some of these ramps. Oh, you want me to play something?
Sure, absolutely.
Oh.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. Go ahead.
A little bit about this clarinet and why I have it in my hand. I always really wanted to play a clarinet and just never had the opportunity. My parents were all musicians and played musical instruments, and I played the ukulele and the baritone uke and the guitar a little bit. I don't do it much anymore because I've lost the strength out of my fingers, and I can't fret the strings very well. But I mentioned to Clara once that I'd always wanted to play the clarinet. So for my birthday one year, she went in and she rented this clarinet. And I says, okay, I'll see if I can get some noise out of it. And so I did get a little noise out of it, and I decided, well, if I can get noise out of it, maybe I can make a few fairly good sounding notes. And so I went and bought a few books and started to try to attempt to play it. And it was an attempt, and then I took some lessons and learned to play it a little bit. I'm no Benny Goodman by any stretch of the imagination, and I play mostly for my own amusement. And Doug insists that I play a couple of numbers here for you, and I hope that they turn out okay. My fingers haven't been working very well the last few days, but we'll see what happens. This is a little song that was written by Bach, and it's titled Musette. It's a neat little song. I like it very much. So much for Musette and Bach. I have a song here I'd like to play for you, and I hope I play this well. The title of it is Hatikvah, and it's the Hebrew national anthem. And the tones of this song, I like the sounds of it. Besides, I tell Claire all the time, with a name like Gimmel, there must be a little Hebrew somewhere in there someplace. I'm not sure. But I hope I play it well, and I hope you like this song. Doug, you'll have to. My fingers aren't working very good.
You want to start over?
Yeah, I'll have to start over. You
want
can
to
cut
get a
that
drink?
one.
Yeah, you want to get another drink?
No, it's just that my reed isn't working well. not wet enough. Let's try it again. I really didn't know I was going to be playing this thing for posterity, I'll tell you. Yeah, let's see here. Here's a song I'll try and play for you. Drink to me only with thine eyes. And I recall singing this song when I sang in the quartet in high school. I would say to each of them that it was my privilege to know each of them, and to have worked with them. And I would hope that they would remember me as an individual who was dedicated to the precepts and concepts of Rotary and each of its avenues of service, and that he tried to his utmost to be an asset to that organization and not a liability. And I would hope that they would remember me as a friend.